Martha Lewis had been a steady presence in the Collins family home for nearly 5 decades. Hired when she was just 22, Martha, now in her late 60s, carried an air of grace and strength that belied her years. She knew every corner of the vast Collins mansion nestled in a quiet, affluent East Coast suburb, a place where old money and generational legacies lived side by side. With her warm, deep brown skin and a slight hunch in her walk, Martha was a part of the home itself, as integral as the stately wood paneling or the grand staircase that spiraled up from the entryway. Her hands were calloused, and her joints ached in the winters, but Martha held herself with a quiet dignity that was hard-earned and firmly rooted. For the Collins family, Martha was more than just the housekeeper. She was a trusted keeper of their lives' intricate details. She knew the family's routines, secrets, and even their hidden fears, though she rarely let on to that knowledge. She had watched Mr. Collins work late into the night in his study, reviewing financial documents, poring over ledgers, and making phone calls well into the early hours. She'd seen Mrs. Collins host grand luncheons and dinner parties with her characteristic poise, always ensuring the family's reputation remained intact. And years ago, she had seen young Sarah Collins grow up, a bright, spirited girl whose laughter once filled the halls. That was long before Sarah left for college, and eventually to make a life of her own away from the family estate. Martha had been there through it all, becoming an almost invisible presence, blending seamlessly into the background of the Collins' lives. She moved about the house with practiced efficiency, seldom breaking her routine. The house was her world as much as it was theirs. She kept its secrets, dusted its surfaces, and held her tongue when old tensions flared. There were days when she felt the weight of her position, a reminder of an unspoken boundary that had always been in place, a line between herself and the family she served. One evening, as Martha finished polishing the silver in the dining room, she caught sight of herself in the reflection of a crystal vase. Her hair was streaked with silver now, and fine lines mapped the corners of her eyes, but her gaze remained sharp, observant. She paused, remembering a younger version of herself, one who had walked into this home with nervous hands and careful steps, eager to prove herself to the Collinses. She was shaken from her reverie when Mrs. Collins entered the room, her usual composed demeanor in place. "Martha, could you make sure everything is ready for tomorrow?" she asked. Her tone was polite, even cordial, but there was always a subtle distance, a reminder that Martha's place, no matter how trusted, was ultimately as an employee. "Yes, ma'am," Martha replied with a small nod, her voice steady, betraying no hint of the memories that had drifted through her mind moments before. As she resumed her tasks, Martha couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation, a subtle shift in the air. She had heard whispers that Sarah was coming home for an extended stay, though no one had told her directly. She wondered what the years had done to the young girl she had once known so well. Sarah Collins returned to the family estate on a late afternoon, her presence announced not by herself, but by the gleaming black SUV that pulled up to the house. Martha watched from the kitchen window as Sarah stepped out, her posture elegant and confident, embodying the polished privilege that surrounded her. She was 30 now, no longer the spirited young girl who once ran barefoot through the gardens. Dressed impeccably in tailored designer clothing, Sarah exuded an air of refinement and control that almost masked the tension lurking beneath her calm exterior. Martha straightened, watching as Sarah made her way to the door. She remembered Sarah as a girl with boundless energy and a laugh that could fill a room. Yet now, something had changed. There was a coldness in her, a hardened look that Martha noticed immediately. The years Sarah had spent away, at prestigious schools and then in the city, living a life of independence and status, had left their mark. The door opened, and Sarah stepped inside, her eyes quickly scanning the room. She spotted Martha, her gaze lingering just a little too long, an unspoken judgment hanging in the air. "Martha," she greeted, her voice smooth but edged with a hint of formality, even detachment. It was a greeting meant for an acquaintance rather than a familiar face. "Welcome home, Miss Sarah," Martha replied, dipping her head slightly, her tone respectful yet warm. She wanted to bridge the distance she felt growing between them, but Sarah's guarded demeanor put her off. Sarah's eyes scanned Martha up and down, her expression almost inscrutable. "It's been a while," she murmured, more to herself than to Martha. "Yes, it has," Martha responded, offering a small, patient smile. "It's good to see you back." Sarah gave a brief nod, then turned her gaze to the grand staircase as if appraising her surroundings. Everything about her body language spoke of someone who felt as though they had outgrown the place, as if she was returning as a guest rather than a daughter of the house. As they stood in silence, Mrs. Collins came into the hallway, her face lighting up as she saw her daughter. "Sarah, darling," she called, arms opening wide. The two women embraced, and Martha could see the warmth in Mrs. Collins's eyes, a mother's pride mingled with relief. Yet, as Sarah glanced at Martha over her mother's shoulder, there was a subtle shift in her expression, an almost imperceptible flicker of suspicion. "How's the house running, Mother?" Sarah asked, her tone casual but with a hint of something sharper beneath it. "Just as you remember," Mrs. Collins replied, her hand resting lightly on Sarah's arm. "Martha's kept everything in perfect order." Sarah's gaze slid back to Martha. "Yes, I'm sure she has." Martha felt the weight of Sarah's words, though she kept her expression neutral. She had seen that look before on others, a mixture of entitlement and skepticism. The girl she had once known had grown into a woman who saw the world through a different lens, one sharpened by years of privilege and independence. Martha wasn't naive. She recognized the caution in Sarah's eyes, a sense that perhaps Martha knew too much or held too much familiarity. "Can I help you with your bags, Miss Sarah?" Martha offered gently, stepping forward. Sarah hesitated, then shook her head, a slight edge to her smile. "No, thank you. I can manage." Mrs. Collins laughed softly, brushing off the tension. "Oh, Martha, you've already done so much. Let Sarah settle in on her own this time." Martha simply nodded, stepping back into the shadows as Sarah moved up the stairs. She watched her retreating figure, a sense of foreboding settling in her chest. It was the same house, the same family, yet Martha could feel a shift, subtle yet undeniable. As Sarah disappeared up the stairs, Martha turned back to her tasks, her mind troubled. She had always been in the background, the reliable, ever-present force holding the house together. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change, and that the return of Sarah Collins was only the beginning. In the days that followed Sarah's return, a subtle tension began to creep into the house. Martha felt it with every glance Sarah cast her way, every curt reply and guarded stare. Sarah moved through the house as though she were inspecting it, checking that everything was exactly as she left it. She noticed every little change, from the new vase in the hallway to the slightly faded curtains in the drawing room. And Martha noticed that Sarah's gaze often lingered on her, as though she were an intruder rather than someone who had spent decades caring for the family and its secrets. One afternoon, as Martha was polishing silverware in the dining room, she sensed Sarah watching her from the doorway. She looked up, meeting Sarah's piercing gaze. "Do you need something, Miss Sarah?" Martha asked, keeping her tone polite. Sarah took a step into the room, crossing her arms. "I've been wondering, Martha," she began, her voice laced with subtle challenge. "You've worked here for so long. You must know everything that happens in this house." Martha hesitated, sensing the accusation buried in the statement. "I do my best to keep everything running smoothly, Miss Sarah," she replied, keeping her gaze steady but neutral. Sarah arched an eyebrow. "You must hear things, see things." She let the words hang in the air, watching Martha's reaction closely. "You probably know more about this family than we do ourselves." Martha kept her voice calm, her hands steady as she continued polishing. "I only see what I need to, Miss Sarah. My job is to keep the house in order." Sarah tilted her head, her expression skeptical. "Is that so?" She paused, glancing around the room as though searching for something. "You're quite trusted here, aren't you, Martha?" Martha could feel the intent behind the words, a probing accusation that Sarah wasn't yet ready to voice outright. But she wouldn't give Sarah the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, meeting Sarah's gaze with quiet dignity. "Your parents have always trusted me to do what's best for this household." Sarah's lips thinned slightly, her fingers tapping against her crossed arms. "Just make sure that trust isn't misplaced," she murmured, turning sharply on her heel and leaving the room without another word. Martha stood there, the words stinging more than she cared to admit. She had dedicated her life to this family, given them loyalty and discretion, often at great personal cost. And yet, here she was, under scrutiny from a girl she had once looked after as if she were her own. She felt the ache of years spent in silence, the sacrifices she had made to keep the Collins family's secrets, but she kept her expression impassive, returning to her work as though the exchange had meant nothing. In the days that followed, Martha began to sense Sarah's suspicion intensify. She would catch Sarah watching her with that same guarded, almost mistrustful expression. There was a tension building, unspoken but thick in the air. And while Martha was used to the complexities of family dynamics, this felt different, darker. She sensed that Sarah was looking for something, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. One evening, as Martha was closing up the kitchen, Sarah entered, her face set in a hard expression. "Martha," Sarah said abruptly, her voice cold, "could I speak with you for a moment?" Martha turned to face her, nodding respectfully. "Of course, Miss Sarah." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you enjoy working here?" she asked, her tone dripping with an almost accusatory tone. Martha met her gaze, unflinching. "Yes, Miss Sarah. I've spent most of my life here. I take pride in my work." Sarah took a step closer, lowering her voice. "And you're loyal to this family, aren't you?" There it was, the accusation Martha had sensed but never expected to hear so bluntly. She held Sarah's gaze, choosing her words carefully. "I've always been loyal to this family, Miss Sarah. I've served this house with respect and care." For a moment, Sarah's mask slipped, and Martha saw a flash of something raw in her expression, anger, or perhaps fear. But it disappeared just as quickly as it had come, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Good," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm watching you, Martha. Don't think I don't notice things." With that, she turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Martha stood alone, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew now that this wasn't just idle suspicion. Sarah had some purpose behind her scrutiny, some buried resentment or fear she couldn't fully understand. But as she watched Sarah disappear into the shadows of the mansion, Martha felt a quiet resolve build within her. She had faced worse than this. She had endured decades of quiet loyalty, keeping the Collins family's secrets safe. Whatever Sarah was looking for, Martha was determined not to let herself be an easy target. The tension in the Collins household reached a new height one evening when Mrs. Collins's cherished emerald necklace went missing. The necklace was a family heirloom, gifted to Mrs. Collins by her mother on her wedding day, and it held deep sentimental and monetary value. The entire family was in an uproar when Mrs. Collins discovered its absence, her panic palpable as she searched frantically through her jewelry box and the surrounding room. Martha was called in immediately, finding Mrs. Collins and Sarah in the master bedroom, which was in disarray. Drawers were open, clothes and jewelry scattered across the bed and floor. Mrs. Collins looked distraught, her usually composed demeanor shattered. "Have you seen it, Martha?" Mrs. Collins asked, her voice trembling. "My emerald necklace, it's gone." Martha's eyes widened slightly, though she kept her face composed. "No, ma'am. I haven't seen it in quite some time. The last I remember, you wore it for the charity gala last month." Mrs. Collins nodded, her hands wringing. Yes, I remember that." She shot a glance at Sarah, who was watching Martha closely, arms crossed, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "Mother," Sarah interrupted, her voice laced with an edge. "We can't just overlook this. Someone in this house must know where it is." She turned her gaze directly to Martha, her eyes narrowing. "Have you checked everywhere, Martha? Every single place it might be?" Martha met her gaze steadily, though her stomach twisted at Sarah's accusatory tone. "I'll help search the entire house if that's what's needed, Miss Sarah," she replied calmly. Sarah's eyes didn't leave Martha's. "Good. Start with your room." The suggestion hung heavily in the air, a blunt accusation that seemed to hit Mrs. Collins as much as it did Martha. "Sarah, That's not necessary, Mrs. Collins said, a hint of unease in her voice. Martha has been with us for years. She's loyal and trustworthy. But Sarah shook her head, her voice sharp. Mother, we can't ignore the fact that it's missing. This isn't about loyalty. It's about getting to the truth. A tense silence filled the room as Martha absorbed the implication. She had spent decades proving her dedication to this family, enduring hardships and sacrifices in the name of loyalty. But now, with a single suggestion from Sarah, her entire legacy in this house seemed to be crumbling before her eyes. With a quiet sigh, Martha looked at Mrs. Collins, then at Sarah. If it will help put your minds at ease, I have no objection to a search. You're welcome to check my room. Mrs. Collins hesitated, looking between her daughter and Martha with uncertainty. But Sarah didn't wait for her mother's consent. She strode out of the room, heading directly toward the narrow servants' quarters at the end of the hallway, her heels clicking against the wooden floor with a determined rhythm. Martha followed in silence, feeling Mrs. Collins's conflicted gaze on her back. Sarah entered Martha's room and began rifling through her things, pulling open drawers, checking under the bed, and sifting through neatly folded clothes in the wardrobe. Martha stood by, her expression unreadable as she watched Sarah tear through her personal belongings with a fervor that bordered on desperation. When Sarah finally turned to Martha, empty-handed and visibly frustrated, her eyes burned with a mixture of anger and suspicion. How is it that you, who knows every corner of this house, haven't seen it? You, who spends more time here than anyone else? Martha took a deep breath, steadying herself before responding. Miss Sarah, I understand your concern, but I would never take something that belongs to this family. I've given my life to this home. Sarah's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Martha saw a glimmer of something else in her eyes, perhaps doubt or fear or even guilt. But it vanished just as quickly, replaced by the same cold mistrust. Let's just say I'm keeping an eye on you, Martha, Sarah murmured, her voice low. I don't know what's going on here, but I intend to find out. Without another word, she swept out of the room, leaving Martha standing alone amidst the remnants of her upturned possessions. Martha's heart pounded, though her face remained calm. She was used to accusations, to being looked down upon, but this felt different. This felt personal. As she slowly began to put her things back in order, Martha felt a knot of anger and sadness settle in her chest. She thought of the years she had spent tending to the Collins family, the times she had protected their secrets, sacrificed her own needs, and kept her silence. And yet, one piece of missing jewelry was enough to cast doubt on her loyalty, to reduce her to a suspect. In that moment, standing alone in her small room, Martha felt the weight of the years, of all the quiet sacrifices and silent humiliations she had endured for this family. And she knew, deep down, that something was changing. The trust she had spent a lifetime building had been shattered, and there was no going back. The next day, tension in the Collins household was so thick it felt tangible. Martha could feel the change in atmosphere as she moved quietly through her daily tasks, the usual rhythm disrupted by Sarah's presence and the lingering suspicion surrounding the missing emerald necklace. By afternoon, Mrs. Collins called everyone together in the main living room, her face drawn with worry. Sarah stood beside her mother, arms crossed and gaze fixed on Martha with a relentless intensity that made Martha's chest tighten. The room filled with a quiet tension as Mr. Collins joined them, unaware of the events unfolding within his own home. He was a man of stern demeanor, accustomed to running his business and family affairs with a firm hand. He glanced between Sarah and his wife, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Would someone care to explain what's going on here?" he asked, his deep voice filling the room. Sarah took it upon herself to answer, her tone clipped and resolute. "The emerald necklace has gone missing, Father, and I believe there's only one person who could have taken it." She turned her gaze to Martha, her eyes narrowing. Martha felt the room grow colder, the eyes of the family now on her, as if waiting for her to defend herself. She straightened her shoulders, summoning every ounce of composure she had. "Mr. Collins, Mrs. Collins, I swear to you, I haven't touched the necklace. I would never take anything from this house." Mr. Collins looked at his wife, confusion crossing his features. Mrs. Collins's face softened with regret, but Sarah was unswayed. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "Martha, if you have nothing to hide, then you won't mind emptying your pockets and showing us what's in your bag." A shocked silence filled the room as Martha processed Sarah's words. The request, no, demand, was humiliating, a show of power and distrust that burned more than any harsh word could. Martha had spent her life giving to this family, going above and beyond to maintain their home and their trust. And yet, here she was, reduced to this moment of degradation. Mrs. Collins opened her mouth to object, but Sarah held up a hand, silencing her mother with a look. "If there's nothing to hide, then there shouldn't be any problem," Sarah insisted, her voice hard and unforgiving. Martha felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her. For a moment, she considered refusing, holding on to the last shreds of her dignity. But she knew that any resistance would only deepen the family's suspicion, would only confirm in their eyes that she had something to conceal. With a heavy sigh, she reached into her apron pockets, turning them out one by one to reveal nothing but a crumpled tissue and a small ring of keys. She then lifted her modest leather bag, opening it to show the contents: her worn-out wallet, a small notepad, and a few other personal items. Nothing that would implicate her, nothing that could tie her to the missing necklace. "There," she said softly, looking directly at Sarah. "Is that enough to satisfy your curiosity, Miss Sarah?" For a brief moment, Sarah's expression faltered. She hadn't found what she was looking for, and a hint of frustration flashed across her face. But rather than back down, she crossed her arms, her tone laced with disdain. "You could have hidden it anywhere. This doesn't prove anything." Mr. Collins cleared his throat, finally stepping in. "Sarah, enough." His voice held a note of finality, his brows furrowed as he looked at his daughter. "Martha has been with us for years. If she says she didn't take it, I believe her." But Sarah shook her head, stubbornly refusing to relent. "Father, you're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. Things don't just disappear. And Martha is the one who knows every inch of this house." Mrs. Collins placed a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. "Sarah, please. Martha has done nothing to deserve this kind of treatment." Still, Sarah wouldn't soften. Her voice grew cold as she said, "I only want the truth. And if Martha has nothing to hide, then she won't mind us keeping an eye on her." The words hung in the air, a final blow that left Martha feeling exposed and humiliated. She gave a small nod, her voice barely a whisper as she replied, "If that's what you feel is necessary, Miss Sarah, then I have no choice but to accept it." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. She didn't let her tears fall until she reached the solitude of her quarters, where the weight of years spent in service and the sting of this betrayal pressed down on her like a heavy stone. The family she had dedicated herself to, the people she had cared for through every triumph and tragedy, had reduced her to a mere suspect, a thief. As she sat in her small room, Martha reflected on her years with the Collinses, the sacrifices she had made, the secrets she had kept. She had been more than a housekeeper. She had been a confidant, a caretaker, even a friend. But now, all of that seemed to mean nothing. That night, Martha lay in her modest bed, her heart heavy with the humiliation she'd endured. She thought of all the years she had spent caring for the Collins family, keeping their secrets and preserving their honor, often at the cost of her own well-being. And yet, a single accusation had been enough to destroy the fragile trust they once held in her. Sleep eluded her, and memories of her early years in the Collins household began to surface. She remembered arriving at the mansion as a young woman, nervous but determined to make a place for herself. Over time, she had found a strange kind of solace within these walls, despite the divide between her and the family. But now, after all these years, it was as though they had erased all her contributions, reducing her to a nameless suspect. Just as she felt herself sinking deeper into despair, there was a soft knock at her door. Startled, Martha sat up, her heart pounding. She opened the door to find Sarah standing. There, her expression unreadable. The sight of her felt like a fresh wound, but Martha held her composure, regarding Sarah with quiet dignity. "May I come in?" Sarah asked, her voice softer than it had been earlier. Martha hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing her in. Sarah looked around the small, sparsely furnished room, her gaze lingering on the few personal items Martha kept: a photograph of her parents, a small wooden cross, a faded leather-bound book. This was Martha's life, the private world she had maintained amid her years of service. Sarah turned to face her, crossing her arms. I need to ask you something," she began, her tone less confrontational but still guarded. Martha nodded, remaining silent, waiting for whatever words Sarah had come to say. After a tense pause, Sarah's gaze dropped, her voice a whisper. "Today, I saw a birthmark on your shoulder when you reached up to the cupboard." She hesitated, her eyes searching Martha's. It looked familiar. Martha felt a chill run through her. That birthmark was one she had rarely thought about over the years, a unique, dark mark that her mother had once told her was an ancestral sign. She had never spoken of it to anyone, nor did she think anyone would notice it. But Sarah had seen it, and something in her expression hinted at more than just curiosity. "I don't understand," Martha replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Why would that matter to you?" Sarah looked down, her hands fidgeting as she finally spoke. "My mother once told me a story, something she never intended me to remember, I think. It was about a woman who had a birthmark like yours. She was connected to my grandfather somehow, though my mother never explained how." Martha's heart pounded as Sarah's words struck a chord. She had always suspected, in the quietest corners of her mind, that there was something more to her presence in the Collins home. She'd noticed the subtle looks from the older family members, the whispers that faded when she entered a room. But she had dismissed those thoughts, not daring to believe there could be more. Her silence seemed to stir something in Sarah, who pressed on. "I started thinking about why you stayed here so long, why you know this house so well. And then, that mark." Sarah trailed off, her expression softening, as if struggling to put words to her own suspicions. Martha took a deep breath, the weight of the truth pressing down on her as she decided to speak. "Your grandfather, Mr. Collins. He was my father." The words left her lips in a whisper, yet they seemed to echo in the small room. Sarah stared at her, shock evident on her face. What are you saying?" Martha's voice was quiet but firm, her years of silence finally broken. "Your grandfather had an affair with my mother many years ago. She was a housemaid here, long before your parents took over. He loved her, or so she believed. But when the time came, he chose the family, the legacy." She paused, her gaze distant. "I was born in secret, and my mother sent me away to be raised by relatives, far from this house. But when I was old enough, I was given a job here. They told me it was a way to honor the family, but I knew it was to keep me close and keep me quiet." Sarah's face paled, her hands trembling slightly as she took in the revelation. "So, all this time, you were family?" Martha nodded slowly. "Yes, but not in a way they wanted to acknowledge. I stayed because I wanted to be near the family that was meant to be mine, even if it was only as a servant." Sarah's expression shifted from shock to something softer, a dawning realization settling over her. For the first time, she looked at Martha not with suspicion, but with a glimmer of understanding, and perhaps even guilt. I had no idea," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I treated you. I accused you," she trailed off, unable to find the words to address the weight of her actions. Martha felt a mix of emotions, relief, sorrow, and a bittersweet vindication. She had waited so long for this moment, but now that it was here, the pain of those lost years felt more poignant than ever. "Yes, you did," she replied gently, her gaze steady. "But now you know, and maybe that can mean something." They stood in silence for a moment, the air thick with the enormity of what had been revealed. Finally, Sarah took a shaky breath. I need to speak to my mother," she said quietly, her voice full of both determination and uncertainty. Martha nodded. "Yes, it's time the truth was brought into the open." As Sarah left the room, Martha felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The truth, once hidden and buried beneath layers of loyalty and silence, was finally exposed. And though she didn't know what lay ahead, she felt, for the first time, that she could finally stand as herself, a member of the Collins family, in her own right. Sarah walked down the long, dimly lit hallway with a new sense of purpose, her mind reeling from the revelation Martha had shared. The very foundations of her life, the stories she had been told about her family, had shifted dramatically. As she approached her mother's sitting room, her pulse quickened. She knew she had to confront her mother and demand the truth, even if it risked shattering the image of the Collins family that had been carefully maintained for generations. Mrs. Collins was seated by the window, a book open on her lap, though her gaze was distant, unfocused. She looked up as Sarah entered, a small smile flickering across her lips, though it quickly faded when she saw the intensity on her daughter's face. "Sarah, darling, is everything all right?" Mrs. Collins asked, setting her book aside and studying her daughter's expression with growing concern. Sarah didn't waste any time. "Mother, I need you to be honest with me," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I just spoke with Martha, and she told me something. Something that I need to hear from you." Mrs. Collins' face paled slightly, her composed expression faltering as she looked away, as if bracing herself for what was coming. "What exactly did Martha tell you?" she asked quietly, her tone guarded. "She told me that she's family," Sarah replied, watching her mother's reaction closely. "That she's my grandfather's daughter, my aunt." A heavy silence fell between them as Mrs. Collins closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as if absorbing the weight of Sarah's words. When she finally opened her eyes, there was a sadness in her gaze, mingled with resignation. "It's true," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Martha is your grandfather's daughter. It was a secret we kept, one that I had hoped would remain hidden. I wanted to protect you, protect our family's reputation." Sarah's face tightened, frustration and hurt evident in her expression. "Protect us? By denying someone their rightful place in this family? By making her live as a servant in the home of her own father's family?" Mrs. Collins looked down, a shadow of regret crossing her face. "You don't understand, Sarah. Times were different back then. Your grandfather? He loved Martha's mother, but he was expected to marry someone of his own standing, someone who would ensure the Collins legacy remained untarnished. When Martha was born, there was no place for her in the family, at least not officially." Sarah shook her head, disbelief and anger simmering in her gaze. "So you just decided to hide her here, to keep her in the shadows? To treat her as less than she is?" Mrs. Collins sighed, her gaze turning distant as she seemed to recall memories she had long buried. "I didn't make the rules, Sarah. I inherited them, just as you did. When Martha came of age, it was decided that she would be given a position here, a way to remain close to the family without causing a scandal. I thought it was the only way." Sarah's expression softened slightly as she absorbed her mother's words, though the bitterness in her tone was still evident. "Do you even understand what that's done to her? She's given her life to this family, sacrificed her own dreams and dignity for us. And all she's gotten in return is suspicion, accusations, and a lifetime of silence." Mrs. Collins looked away, clearly struggling with her own guilt. "I know," she whispered. "I've thought about it often, but once we set that path, there was no turning back. It became easier to pretend she was only the housekeeper, that the past was something best left forgotten." Sarah crossed her arms, her gaze steady as she looked at her mother. "But you didn't forget, did you? You knew the whole time, and you let her carry that burden alone." Mrs. Collins' eyes filled with tears, a rare vulnerability breaking through her usual composure. "I thought I was doing what was best for everyone, for the family. But now, I see that I was wrong. I see the pain it's caused, to her and now to you as well." For a moment, they sat in silence, the gravity of their conversation settling over them both. Finally, Mrs. Collins took a shaky breath, looking up at Sarah with a mixture of resolve and sorrow. "What do you want to do, Sarah?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What can we do now to make this right?" Sarah's gaze softened, a flicker of understanding breaking through her anger. "We can start by acknowledging her, by giving her the respect and place she deserves. She's family, whether the world knows it or not. She deserves to be treated as such. Mrs. Collins nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. You're right. It's long overdue. The two women sat together in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For Mrs. Collins, the moment was one of reckoning, a chance to finally confront the painful choices of the past and attempt to make amends. For Sarah, it was a moment of awakening, a new understanding of the complexities and sacrifices that had shaped her family's legacy. After a while, Mrs. Collins spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. I'll speak to Martha. I'll apologize. And I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Sarah nodded, a hint of relief visible in her eyes. We both will. She deserves that much, at least. As they sat there, a fragile sense of hope began to grow between them, the first step in a journey toward healing the wounds that had festered in silence for too long. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt she was seeing her mother as a person, flawed and human, grappling with the weight of her own choices. And as they prepared to face Martha together, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning of a long overdue reconciliation, one that would reshape the Collins family forever. The next morning, Mrs. Collins stood outside Martha's door, her hand hovering just above the handle. She had spent the entire night replaying her conversation with Sarah, grappling with memories she had tried to bury and the pain she had caused. Now, faced with Martha, she felt the full weight of her decisions pressing down on her, each step toward Martha's room feeling heavier than the last. Finally, with a deep breath, she knocked. After a few moments, Martha opened the door, her face calm but her eyes guarded. She had been expecting this visit. Sarah's confession had likely left little choice for Mrs. Collins but to confront the truth. The two women stood in silence, each gauging the other, feeling the unspoken tension between them. Martha, Mrs. Collins began, her voice shaky. May I come in? Martha nodded and stepped aside, allowing her in. Mrs. Collins took a seat on the single chair in the modest room, noticing for the first time how little Martha had, how spare and humble her life here had been. She took a breath, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. I'm sure you know why I'm here, Mrs. Collins said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Martha remained standing, her posture erect, her eyes steady but filled with years of quiet pain. Yes, ma'am. I assume Sarah told you what I shared with her last night. Mrs. Collins nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. She did. And I want to start by saying how profoundly sorry I am, Martha. For everything. She paused, her voice wavering. You were kept here, close to us, but always kept at a distance. It was unfair. It was cruel. And you didn't deserve it. Martha's face softened slightly, though her expression remained guarded. Thank you for saying that, Mrs. Collins. But words alone can't undo what's been done. Mrs. Collins looked up, meeting Martha's eyes, her own filled with remorse. I know. I can't change the past, but I want to try to make amends. Your family, Martha, even if we failed to acknowledge it. And from this moment forward, I want that to change. Martha's gaze flickered with something between disbelief and hope. She had spent so many years resigning herself to her place in this household, to being the hidden thread in the Collins tapestry, seen only when it served the family's purpose. Now, hearing these words from Mrs. Collins felt both liberating and bittersweet. Why now? Martha asked quietly, her voice carrying years of pain. Why, after all this time? I've spent my whole life serving this family, watching from the shadows, never allowed to be who I truly am. Mrs. Collins swallowed, her face pale. Because I was selfish, Martha. I was scared of scandal, of losing what the family had built. But I see now that those fears were nothing compared to what you must have endured. I chose comfort over kindness, and that was wrong. I'm so sorry. Martha regarded her silently, the years of sacrifice and silent suffering surfacing in her mind. She wanted to forgive, to let go of the bitterness she had buried for so long. But she couldn't deny the wounds left by decades of feeling invisible, of being treated as less than the family she had quietly served. Apologies are one thing, Mrs. Collins, Martha replied slowly, her voice steady. But respect and acknowledgement are another. Mrs. Collins nodded, her eyes filled with a genuine sadness. "You have my respect, Martha, and my gratitude. From this moment forward, you will be treated as part of this family. Not as an employee, not as a secret, but as you truly are." Martha felt a stirring of emotion she hadn't expected, a glimmer of something she had thought lost: dignity, self-worth. She took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I don't want pity or handouts, Mrs. Collins. I just want the truth to be acknowledged. For myself, and for the memory of my mother, who loved your father despite everything." Mrs. Collins nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Then that is what you shall have. From this day forward, we will honor both you and her. The Collins family will know who you are, Martha. No more secrets." The two women looked at each other, a fragile understanding forming between them. For Mrs. Collins, it was a painful but necessary reckoning. For Martha, it was a long overdue recognition, one that didn't erase the past but allowed her to finally step into the light, to be seen and valued. Just then, Sarah appeared in the doorway, having overheard part of the conversation. She looked between her mother and Martha, a tentative smile forming on her face. She took a step forward, her voice full of quiet determination. "We'll do this together, Martha," Sarah said, her tone sincere. "From now on, things will be different. I promise." Martha studied the young woman who had once looked at her with suspicion, who had confronted her with such cruelty just days before. But now, in Sarah's eyes, she saw a different kind of resolve, one born of understanding and perhaps even respect. "Thank you, Miss Sarah," Martha replied, allowing a small, cautious smile. "I hope that, with time, things truly will be different." The three women stood together in that small, modest room, each carrying the weight of their own realizations. For Martha, it was a moment of healing, a chance to reclaim her identity and finally be recognized. For Mrs. Collins and Sarah, it was a moment of reckoning, a chance to make amends for the past and begin a new chapter based on truth and respect. As they left the room, Mrs. Collins turned to Martha one last time. "Will you join us for dinner tonight, Martha, as part of the family?" The invitation hung in the air, tentative yet genuine. Martha nodded, feeling a mix of emotions she couldn't quite put into words. "I'd like that, Mrs. Collins." And with that, they began a journey toward healing, each step marked by understanding, reconciliation, and the hope that the Collins family could, at last, build a legacy rooted in truth. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the Collins estate, Martha prepared herself for dinner. It felt strange to step into the dining room not as a silent observer or a server but as a guest, someone acknowledged and welcomed by the family she had spent her life serving. She took a moment to compose herself, smoothing down the simple but elegant dress she'd chosen, a soft, modest garment that held more meaning to her than any uniform ever could. When she finally entered the dining room, the scene she encountered took her by surprise. The Collins family, including Mr. Collins, who was usually reserved and distant, stood waiting for her. Mrs. Collins stepped forward, offering Martha a warm smile, her earlier remorse still evident but now softened by a newfound sense of purpose. "Martha," she said, extending a hand toward an empty seat at the dining table, "please, sit with us." Martha nodded, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. She took her place at the table, feeling both exposed and embraced. Across from her sat Sarah, who met her gaze with a mixture of humility and sincerity, as though she was silently conveying her own apology, her own understanding of what this moment meant. As the first course was served, the silence in the room was filled with an unspoken sense of change, of the shift in dynamics they were all adjusting to. Finally, Mr. Collins cleared his throat, looking directly at Martha for perhaps the first time in years. "I want to apologize, Martha," he said, his voice low but firm. I know that my family has not always treated you with the respect you deserve. You've been a part of our lives for so long, yet we've failed to acknowledge who you truly are. And for that, I am deeply sorry." Martha felt a pang in her chest, the words resonating with all the years of silent suffering and unacknowledged loyalty. She nodded, meeting his gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Collins." It means a great deal to me to hear that. Mrs. Collins, visibly moved, took a deep breath before addressing the table. Tonight, we want to acknowledge the truth of who Martha is. Not just a loyal servant, but a member of this family. She looked at Sarah, a silent prompt, and Sarah took over, her voice steady. Martha, Sarah began, I want you to know that I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. I acted out of suspicion and pride, and I realize now how wrong I was. I hope you can forgive me. I want to be a better person, and a better niece. To you. Martha's heart softened as she looked at Sarah, seeing genuine regret and sincerity in her eyes. She reached across the table, placing a gentle hand over Sarah's. I forgive you, Sarah, and I hope with time, we can grow closer as family. Sarah nodded, a small, relieved smile breaking through her reserved demeanor. For the first time, Martha sensed that the young woman she had once cared for was beginning to see her in a new light. A figure who had endured hardship and injustice, yet remained dignified and gracious. As the dinner continued, the tension in the room eased, replaced by the warmth of shared laughter and conversation. They spoke of memories, both lighthearted and solemn, bridging years of separation with stories and questions. Sarah asked Martha about her past, her childhood, and Martha felt a sense of liberation in sharing pieces of herself she had long kept hidden. At one point, Mrs. Collins excused herself briefly, returning with a small, intricately carved wooden box. She placed it in front of Martha, her hands trembling slightly. This belonged to your mother, she said quietly, her voice laced with emotion. She kept it here, and when she passed, I held on to it, not knowing how or when to give it to you. I think now is the right time. Martha's breath caught as she opened the box, revealing a collection of simple but cherished items. A small, worn-out photograph of her mother as a young woman, a delicate brooch, and a letter written in a neat, familiar script. She recognized her mother's handwriting instantly, and a tear slipped down her cheek as she gently touched the items. Thank you, Martha whispered, her voice breaking. This means more to me than you could ever know. Mrs. Collins reached out, covering Martha's hand with her own. It's yours, and we hope that, in time, we can be the family you should have had all along. The evening concluded with a sense of peace that Martha had never thought possible in this house. As the family shared dessert and exchanged more stories, Martha felt as if a weight had finally lifted from her heart. She was no longer invisible, no longer bound by the secrets that had kept her in the shadows. When dinner ended, Mrs. Collins walked Martha back to her quarters, pausing at the door. Martha, if you ever want to stay elsewhere, to pursue your own life outside of these walls, we'll understand. We'll support you, whatever you decide. Martha looked at her, a gentle smile forming. Thank you. But for now, I think I'd like to stay. There's healing to be done here, and I'd like to be part of that. Mrs. Collins nodded, a tearful smile on her face. Then we're grateful to have you, truly. As Martha closed her door that night, she felt a deep sense of peace. The Collins family's recognition had given her a long-awaited sense of closure, an acknowledgement of her place and identity that she had yearned for all her life. From that day forward, the Collins household was forever changed. Martha was no longer simply the housekeeper. She was part of the family, cherished and respected in a way that honored the sacrifices she and her mother had made. And as the days passed, the house filled not only with routines and obligations, but with a warmth and unity that could finally heal the fractures of the past. In the days that followed, the Collins household embraced a gentle transformation. The once unspoken boundaries that had divided Martha from the family began to dissolve. She found herself invited into conversations, encouraged to share her thoughts, and, most importantly, treated with genuine warmth and respect. The feeling was new, and it took some time for her to grow accustomed to it. But each day brought a deeper sense of belonging and acceptance. One morning, as Martha moved through the garden, enjoying a rare moment of solitude, she noticed Sarah approaching her, carrying a large, worn leather book. It was the family's photo album, a collection of memories spanning generations. Sarah held it with both hands, a look of determination mixed with warmth in her expression. "Good morning, Martha," she greeted softly, her voice carrying a hint of the camaraderie that had grown between them since that first night of revelations. "Good morning, Miss Sarah," Martha replied, still feeling the habit of formality, though Sarah had gently insisted she could call her simply by her first name now. Sarah smiled, glancing down at the album. "I brought this to share with you. I thought, maybe we could look through it together?" Martha's heart swelled at the gesture, the recognition of her place in the family history evident in Sarah's simple act. She nodded, a warm smile spreading across her face. "I'd like that very much." They sat together on a bench beneath a blooming magnolia tree, its branches casting dappled sunlight on the album as Sarah opened it. Page by page, they traveled through decades of family history. Martha recognized many faces from her years of service, some of whom had passed, and others she had only heard about through family stories. She pointed out details to Sarah, moments that only she would remember. Then, they reached a page that held one of the earliest photos in the album. And it was Martha's mother, young and radiant, standing beside Sarah's grandfather, who wore a shy smile. They looked almost carefree, captured in a moment of vulnerability and affection that had long since been buried by time and discretion. Martha's eyes softened as she looked at the photograph, and Sarah gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "She was beautiful," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with sincerity. "Yes," Martha replied, her voice a blend of pride and nostalgia. "She was strong and kind, and she loved him truly." Sarah's eyes filled with a deep understanding as she looked between the photo and Martha. "I want you to know, Martha, that I'm going to make sure her story, and yours, becomes part of our family's legacy. I think it's time the truth was known, not hidden." Martha's heart tightened with gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah. That means more than you can imagine." They spent the rest of the morning together, the album bridging the years of distance and silence. By the time they closed it, there was an undeniable sense of connection, a bond that transcended both blood and the family's fraught history. Martha felt, for the first time, that she truly belonged, not just within the Collins house but within its story. In the following months, Martha's role in the household evolved. She no longer wore the uniform of a housekeeper but dressed as herself, a respected member of the Collins family. She continued to help where needed, not out of obligation but out of a love for the home that had once held so much pain and now promised healing. And the Collins family, in turn, began to rely on her wisdom, her stories, and her strength in ways they hadn't before. Family gatherings grew warmer, more open. Martha became a trusted confidant to Sarah, a source of insight and advice. Sarah, for her part, made a concerted effort to honor Martha's mother's memory, working with her mother to acknowledge the woman who had once been hidden. Mrs. Collins even commissioned a small portrait of Martha's mother, which she placed among the family's gallery, a quiet, dignified recognition of a life that had once been kept in the shadows. One evening, as they gathered for dinner, Mr. Collins raised his glass, his eyes finding Martha's with a look of respect and gratitude. "To Martha," he said, his voice filled with quiet reverence, "for her loyalty, her grace, and for finally bringing our family the truth we so desperately needed." Everyone lifted their glasses, echoing the toast, and Martha felt her eyes fill with tears, a mixture of joy and release. She had spent her life waiting for this moment, and now, surrounded by a family that embraced her as one of their own, she felt whole. As the night wore on, laughter filled the room, stories shared and memories made anew. For the first time, Martha could feel the generations of the Collins family, her family, coming together in unity, the past woven seamlessly into the present. And though the wounds of the past would never completely fade, the Collins family had chosen a path of healing and honesty, one that Martha would walk with them, step by step. In that moment, Martha knew that she had finally come home, not as a servant or an outsider, but as a cherished part of the Collins legacy. Her journey had been long, marked by silence and sacrifice, but now it was one of dignity and love, bound together by the truth that had finally set her free. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving.